Alright, quick reset before we get into anything else. This video was supposed to be a Dragonite and Magenium Battle Pass breakdown. That was the plan. But while I was prepping for that, I ended up going way deeper in on a different idea, and it turned into something that I think is honestly more interesting than a static deck review. So instead of forcing that original plan, we're pivoting. And the reason we're pivoting is because this deck, even though it's not quite there yet, is a perfect vehicle for explaining how I actually approach deck building. This is not going to be a play this list video. It's also not a this deck is secretly broken video. This is a process video, where I start with a card that looks absurd on paper, build around it as honestly as possible, run it into real games, and show you exactly where that plan starts to crack. And the card that kicked this all off is Erika's Tangela. Because when you first read Tangela's effect, your brain immediately goes, wait, that's not how setup is supposed to work. And when a card breaks one of the fundamental rules of the game, whether it's setup speed, evolution timing, or board development, that's usually worth investigating, even if it turns out the deck isn't meta ready yet. So what I want to do in this video is walk you through why Erika's Tangela made me stop, how I translated that idea into a list, what actually happened when I played it, and how I tried and mostly failed to fix its biggest weakness. Because even when the deck doesn't quite get there, how it fails can teach you way more than a list that kind of just works. So with that framing in mind, let's talk about what this deck is trying to do at a high level. Before we get into the card by card stuff, I want to be really clear about what this video is and what it isn't. This is not a final deck list showcase. I'm not telling you play this at your next event. And I'm also not trying to convince you that this deck is secretly broken or being slept on. What this is a walkthrough of a deck building process, from the first idea through the first build into real games, and then through the revisions that come from actually seeing the deck fail. Because that's the part of deck building that doesn't get shown very often. Most of the time, you only see the end result. You don't see the wrong assumptions, the overcorrections, or the cards that looked perfect until you actually put them on the table. In this video, we're going to do all of that out in the open. We'll start with the initial idea behind the deck and why it looked so promising. Then we'll talk through how that idea translated into actual card choices, especially in the trainer lineup, because that's where most of the real decisions live. After that, I'll show you what happened when I played it, both the turns where everything worked and the turns where it absolutely did not. And finally, we'll revisit the list with that information in mind and talk about what helped, what didn't, and what problems still don't have a clean answer yet. So if you're looking for a quick tier list or a solved list, this probably isn't that video. But if you're interested in how to evaluate a card, build around it honestly, and then adjust when it really pushes back, this is exactly that video. With that framing in mind, let's start with the card that made this whole thing worth exploring in the first place. So, everything about this deck starts with Erika's Tangela. And I don't mean that in a vague, this is the engine kind of way. I mean the entire deck building idea only exists because of how Tangela's effect actually works in practice. On paper, Tangela looks like a simple setup card. It searches another Erika's Pokemon and puts it into your hand. But the important thing isn't that it searches, it's that it can search itself. If you start with one Tangela in the active or on the bench, that Tangela can find another Tangela. That Tangela can find another Tangela. And that third Tangela can find a Bellsprout. So instead of spending multiple turns developing your board, you can realistically go from one Pokemon in play to a full bench in a single turn. It's kind of like a free Precious Trolley as a Pokemon ability. That already breaks one of the normal assumptions of the game, which is that board development takes time or an Ace Spec. Now, the reason that matters is because of Erika's Victory Bell. Victory Bell's attack, Flower Garden Rondo, scales directly off of how many of Erika's Pokemon you have on your bench. So every Tangela you chain, every Bellsprout you grab, every evolution you stick, all of that translates straight into damage. And that's the key synergy. Tangela doesn't just set up your board, it preloads Victory Bell's damage. And once you layer Forest of Vitality on top of that, things get even more aggressive. Forest lets you skip the normal evolution pacing, so those Tangela you just benched can immediately turn Weeping Bells into Victory Bells. That's how you end up with a one-prize Pokemon threatening 240 damage as early as turn 2. So the initial idea here wasn't complicated. Use Tangela to cheat setup speed, use Forest of Vitality to cheat evolution speed, and use Victory Bell to convert raw board presence into immediate pressure. At this stage, before any games were played, that plan felt not just reasonable, but strong. Because if a one prize deck can set up this fast and threaten real damage this early, it's at least worth stress testing. So with that core synergy in mind, the next step was translating it into an actual list, starting with the Pokemon lineup. Once the Tangela to Victreebel synergy was clear, the Pokemon lineup was actually the easiest part of the deck to build, and that's usually a good sign. The guiding rule here was simple. If Tangela floods the board with Erika's Pokemon, then I want every Pokemon in the deck to reinforce that plan. So the list is basically just 4 of Tangela, Bellsprout, Weepinbell, and Victreebel. No side engines, no utility basics, no one of tech Pokemon. The reason for that is straightforward. Victreebel's damage scales off the number of Erika's Pokemon on your bench, so every non-Erika's Pokemon you add doesn't just take up space, it can actively lower your damage ceiling. That means every Pokemon slot has to justify itself not just in isolation, but in terms of how it affects every future attack. That's also why Erika's Vileplume isn't in this list, and it's worth being really explicit about it. The first issue is structural. Vileplume is a non-Tangela Pokemon, and now that's technically also true of the Bellsprout line, but the difference is the Bellsprout evolves into your primary attacker. It's mandatory for the deck to function. Vileplume isn't. Even a modest 2/2/2 Oddish Gloom Vileplume line dilutes a lot of things at once. It dilutes your opening hand, your top decks, your variable search like bug catching set, and potentially your bench space. And in a deck where bench slots directly convert to damage, that last point really matters. The second issue is that in this deck, Vileplume's ability just isn't functional in practice. Healing 30 damage from Erika's Pokemon once per turn sounds awesome, and with the right shell, it could be an interesting counter to Munkidori's spread damage that removes the damage instead of trading it back to your opponent. But right now, most spread-based damage comes from tech cards, not from full archetypes built around chip damage. Unless you saw my video on Munkidori, Budew, and Frostlass, which was exactly that. And more importantly, this deck is already planning for its Victreebels to get knocked out. They have relatively low HP, and most of the decks we care about aren't slowly chipping them down, they're taking them out in one swing. So healing 30 just doesn't meaningfully change the outcome. You're spending deck space, setup time, and bench slots on a card that doesn't actually move the needle in the matchups that matter. So for this deck, Vileplume just isn't necessary. It actively works against what the deck is trying to do. So the Pokemon lineup ends up being very lean and very focused. Everything here exists to either accelerate setup through Tangela or convert that setup into damage through Victreebel. At this point in the process, I was feeling pretty good. Pokemon made sense, the synergy was clean, and nothing felt like filler, which is usually when the real deck building decisions start, because now you have to figure out whether the trainer cards actually let the plan function in real games. So with the Pokemon locked in, the next step was building the trainer engine, and this is where things got a lot more complicated. Once the Pokemon lineup was locked, this is where the deck actually stopped being theoretical, because at this point the question isn't what does the deck want to do, it's can the trainer engine actually support that plan in real games. And I want to start by making something clear up front. Most of the trainer cards in this list are not about setup, they're about recovery. That's an important distinction because the deck doesn't really struggle to get going. If you open Tangela, you're usually fine. What you're worried about is what happens after you get your first big attack. So cards like Chorus, Bug Catching Set, and Pokepad are doing a very specific job here. They're not trying to turbo the deck faster. They're there to make sure that when things go wrong, when pieces get KO'd, when Force of Vitality gets bounced, when your first Victreebel dies, you can actually put the deck back together. Chorus is especially important here because it gives you access to key pieces without forcing you into awkward energy requirements. It doesn't accelerate energy, but it does make sure you're seeing enough cards to keep functioning. Bug Catching Set does something similar, but in a more targeted way. It helps you recover Pokemon and grass pieces without having to overcommit slots to raw draw. And Pokepad is doing a lot of quiet work here, because when your whole deck is built on non-EX Pokemon, Pokepad is basically a guaranteed hit. It's not digging and hoping, it's smoothing out the edges of the Tangela cascade so that like if one of them is KO'd or one of them is prized, you still have access to those pieces that you need when you need them. All of this is about resilience. None of it is flashy, but without it the deck just doesn't hold together. Now this is where my first real mistake happened. Once I saw Victreebel consistently hitting for around 240, my instinct was to push that number, so Brave Bangle went in almost immediately. Jumping from 240 to 270 actually matters against a lot of common board pieces, and it forces more honest responses from your opponent. The problem is what comes after that thought. Once you start thinking about damage, it's very easy to go one step further and ask, okay, how do we make this number even bigger? That's where Max Belt enters the conversation. And on paper, Max Belt looks like it should be incredible, but when you actually run the numbers, Nothing changes. You're still 2-hitting the Pokemon that matter. You're still getting KO'd in one turn, and you're still losing tempo after your attacker dies. So all you've really done is spend an Ace Spec slot to feel better about your damage math, without improving your win condition. And that was the first big red flag. At that point, the Ace Spec slot became the focus, because if there was a way to fix this deck, it probably lived there. And this is where things got interesting, because every Ace Spec I looked at was solving a problem I wanted to have, not the one I actually had. Scramble Switch assumes that your attacker survives a hit so that you can move the energy from it to a benched Pokemon. Prime Catcher assumes you already have a powered attacker ready to capitalize on the gust. Dangerous Laser assumes the game is going to slow down long enough for the burn damage to accumulate. Hero's Cape assumes that adding bulk will meaningfully change combat math, which against most of the decks we care about, it doesn't. Individually, all of these cards are powerful, but none of them actually address what keeps ending games for this deck. And that's when I realized I needed to stop looking for a card that made my good turns better and start looking for something that made the deck survive its bad turns. Because at this point, the pattern was clear. The deck wasn't failing because it lacked power. It was failing because once its first attacker went down, it struggled to stay relevant. And that's the problem we're going to put on the table when we look at actual gameplay. At this point, I realized what a daunting task really showcasing all of this theory crafting and deck building would be. It was also at this point that I decided this idea wasn't going to be one video, it was going to be two. Next week, we'll look at all the gameplay from the first iteration of the deck and sum up what worked and what didn't, followed by some revisions and then testing those revisions on the ladder. If you've watched this far, please know how much I value your viewership. Thank you for watching. If you like this video and this approach to documenting my deck building process, feel free to like the video and/or subscribe. Or comment down below with either your favorite Ace Spec or the Ace Spec you think we should play in this deck, and I'll see you next week.